Hi, welcome to Muse Egyptology. My name is Kate and I'm an Egyptologist, and it's my mission to teach you about ancient Egypt, the museums that celebrate it, and take you along for the journey with me doing my research and writing for this YouTube channel. Starting afresh teaching ancient Egypt to a new group of people, I had a conundrum. Where on earth do I start? Ancient Egypt has over 3,000 years of history, dozens and dozens of rulers, and innumerable topics of study. So I've decided to start by teaching you about the New Kingdom. This is the period of Egyptian history with loads of famous pharaohs and events and all sorts of really interesting things. So for the pharaohs, we've got, for example, Rameses II, Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, Hatshepsut, the Amenhoteps, the Tutmoses, there are other Rameses, there are a lot of them. And we've got loads of interesting historical events and lots of interesting changes. During some parts of this period, Egypt was wealthy and secure, and at other times it was under pressure from foreign enemies and economic challenges. So it's really interesting to see what the pharaohs decided to spend their energy and resources on during this period. This is a period of warfare and diplomacy in Syria-Palestine and oppression and control in Nubia, extending Egypt's scope of control to amass a huge empire. There were important building programs such as at temples like Karnak, Luxor and Abydos, new palaces and even new cities such as Amarna and Per-Ramesses, and a strong focus on the cult of the state god Amun or Amun-Ra, and a significant increase in the power and wealth of his cult and priesthood. There were changes to royal funerary practices, with pharaohs' tombs now in the Valley of the Kings and having separate mortuary temples, and the development and use of the Book of the Dead for both royals and non-royals. And an increased focus on the ideology of kingship, the cult of the pharaoh and rules for the royal family, in an effort to keep the king powerful and relevant and to prevent usurpers and rivals from seizing the throne. But most importantly, the New Kingdom is a period with a relatively large amount of artistic, textual and archaeological evidence for the kings, elite and government, their actions and policies, historical events, and the daily lives of commoners, so we can piece together a picture of ancient Egypt during this period with some degree of accuracy. Cat. Hi, Rosie. I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you my babies. So this is my cat Rosie. I've got 2 dogs and 2 cats. And on this YouTube channel, they will be the stars as long as they choose to come on camera. Okay, let's get back to it. So all of this means that it's a fantastic period to learn about ancient Egypt. And we can use the New Kingdom as a comparison against which to learn and compare about earlier and later periods of ancient Egyptian history, which we will be doing in the future videos. Before we go any further, I wanted to mention that this particular video is going to be longer than most videos on this channel. It's quite a big subject, talking about the New Kingdom anyway, but I'm also going to be talking about another period of Egyptian history. We've got lots of subtopics to talk about. It is an introduction to the New Kingdom, but it is quite long. But all the future videos will be shorter, more bite-sized, so please hang on in there. The title of this video is "To Understand Rameses II's Egypt, You Should Learn This." What I actually mean is the wider New Kingdom, the period in which Rameses reigned. This video is a very brief introduction to the New Kingdom, and there are some topics we won't have time to discuss today, such as the really interesting Amarna period of Akhenaten and its repercussions, which definitely had an impact on Rameses II's Egypt. We'll go into detail about this and many other important and interesting topics in the rest of this video series. So, to answer the title question, in my opinion, What you need to learn about to understand the New Kingdom is the time of civil war and instability that immediately preceded it in Egyptian history, the Second Intermediate Period, with its historical events, worries and problems, and socio-political changes that sets the context for the New Kingdom. This has been really interesting for me to revisit, as I didn't remember a great deal about it since leaving university, so I spent a couple of weeks learning about it. I decided to start reading the history book that we were recommended at uni, the textbook we used, the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, edited by one of my old lecturers, Ian Shaw. In my welcome video, the first video on my channel, I promised to discuss the books I'm using to research ancient Egypt, so let's chat about this one. Each chapter in the book, divided by historical period or sub-period from the Paleolithic times to the end of the Roman period, is written by a different Egyptologist with a specialism in that time. And the book is a very useful resource as it also has a very detailed further reading section, a glossary, and my favourite, the chronology section or king list, which I often refer to. This book was originally published in the year 2000, so it is old now, and while new discoveries have made it out of date, I think it's still a valuable resource, and I'll continue to use it alongside more up-to-date articles and books discussing newer theories and finds. In comparison to the New Kingdom, just 100 years later or so, we have very few textual sources about the Second Intermediate Period, which can make it very difficult to understand this period fully. And in fact, Egyptologists still debate about, or don't know about, some fundamental aspects of the history of this period, such as when it actually started and which king reigned when. In ancient history, sometimes we just have to accept that there are things we don't know and may never know. But historians and archaeologists are working to improve our knowledge and understanding all the time. The majority of the evidence for this period is archaeological, such as evidence of architecture showing what kings built, pottery of different types and stylistic origins, such as Egyptian styles versus Syria-Palestine-inspired vessels versus Kerma-ware from Nubia, giving evidence for trade between different groups and who lived where in Egypt or Nubia, as well as destruction layers indicating battles had taken place and subsequent belligerent demolition of sites. It looks like I'm doing some really studious reading in this footage, but I was actually trying to fix a mistake. The evening before this footage I was tired, reading until bedtime, and I decided to skip some of the archaeological and material culture descriptions as they are very detailed and seemed irrelevant to my planned very brief summary of the Second Intermediate Period that I'll give you in a bit. However, the next day I continued reading further into the chapter and I realised I did need to go back and read those paragraphs, but I had lost my place. So this footage is me wasting 45 minutes skim reading to try to find where I'd abandoned my reading. Something you need to know about me, possibly caused by my ADHD, or maybe not, is that I have a terrible memory when confronted with a lot of information, so I need to reread each page to trigger my memory and be confident that I'd found my place again. Therefore, this week's ADHD or study tip is to use a bookmark of some sort that can stick onto the edge of the page, such as this one, that can mark exactly where you need to carry on writing. And if you've got bad memory like me, maybe put a tick against paragraphs you have read or a cross against paragraphs that you've skipped, so you can come back to them and know whether you have or haven't read them and not waste time. Let's talk about the Second Intermediate Period. So today we are talking primarily about the New Kingdom, this blue period here, but we are also talking about the period that immediately preceded it, the Second Intermediate Period. So as you'll see from the middle of this timeline of ancient Egyptian history, we've got kingdoms followed by intermediate periods, followed by kingdoms, followed by intermediate periods, etc. We've got three of each: the Old Kingdom, Middle and New Kingdom, and the first, second and third intermediate periods. Kingdoms were periods when there was strong centralised kingship, with one king on the throne, ruling the whole country. Then there was some sort of weakness on the throne, some period of decline, which eventually led to local rulers becoming strong enough to rule their own area in rivalry with the king, and this is an intermediate period. It is a period where the country is divided. There's two or more kings or rulers, each ruling part of the country, and there is tensions, rivalry, there are internal borders, unhappy stalemates, leading potentially to rival rulers fighting local battles for land and power, and capital cities being attacked in civil war, and then eventually one king becomes powerful enough to defeat the other king and reunifies the whole country until it's a kingdom again. As the name suggests, the Second Intermediate Period is one of those periods of disunity in Egypt. As discussed, the evidence for this period is scanty, so we don't know exactly how it got to this stage, but basically, very quickly, the north of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast down to Kusai, about halfway down the country, was ruled by one king. And at the same time, the southern half of Egypt, from Kusai down to the border at Elephantine, was ruled by another king. The northern king's residence was a city called Avaris in the northeastern delta. This city had been occupied by Egyptians and people of Asiatic origin for decades, living together amicably. But at some point, a powerful elite emerged among the Syro-Palestinians called the Hyksos, until one of the Hyksos became king of the area. Thereafter, there continued to be one Hyksos king after another ruling the northern half of Egypt. This is called Lower Egypt, and they ruled for about 100 years, maybe more. At the same time, powerful Egyptians based in Thebes ruled southern or Upper Egypt one after another. Although during earlier times during this period, some individual cities such as Abydos, Edfu and Elephantine may have been ruled by powerful independent rulers who were not tied to the king at Thebes. But eventually the Theban king did rule the whole of this area of the south of Egypt. The Egyptians in southern Egypt were in a very dangerous position. They were the filling of an enemy sandwich. Although normal Asiatics, Egyptians and Nubians were able to pass from one region to another, for example to do trade, if they were permitted by the border guards and paid the relevant tax to that king of the area, the kings and governments knew of the threat of their neighbours. The Hyksos kings in the north had a powerful ally in Nubia against Egypt's southern border. He was the king of Kush and he ruled basically the whole of Nubia. So the Theban kings in Upper Egypt or southern Egypt had the Hyksos to their north and the Nubians to their south, and the Hyksos kings also had their own allies in Syria-Palestine. So the Theban kings were really bordered by two very powerful enemies. Upper Egypt therefore stood alone militarily, but the Theban kings in the south believed they had the right to rule the whole of Egypt, being the ideological descendants of the old kings of the whole of Egypt, the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, the lords of the two lands. Finally, after around 80 years of Hyksos rule in the north, the Theban king Seqenenre-Ptah decided that enough was enough and that he would declare war on the Hyksos. He was trying to seize his country back, and this war lasted for approximately 30 years on and off. Seqenenre-Ptah actually died in battle. He died a very violent death, as is demonstrated by his mummy. And he was succeeded by a man called Kamose, who might or might not have been Seqenenre-Ptah's son. Kamose led 2 military expeditions early on in his reign. The first was to Buhen in Lower Nubia, as he couldn't defeat the Hyksos in the north, while the Hyksos' ally, the powerful king of Kush, was Egypt's southern border neighbour. Kamose's army managed to retake the fort of Buhen that had been established by the Egyptians in Nubia during the Middle Kingdom in order for them to be able to control this region and to be able to get access to the valuable gold mines in Nubia. So by retaking this fort, he was able to control the whole of the Nile Valley north of Buhen, so north of the Second Cataract in Nubia, right up until the Egyptian border. And by doing this, he forced the Kerma Nubians south, so that the rivals, the enemies that belonged to the army and just generally to the population that were loyal to the king of Kush were no longer threats to Egypt, or no longer immediate threats to Egypt, because they couldn't actually access Egyptian southern border easily. And that meant they couldn't launch a sudden attack on Egypt. Kamose's other expedition was back to Avaris, about which he wrote, "My intention is to rescue Egypt and drive out the Asiatics." Unfortunately, he didn't defeat the Hyksos, and this might have just been quite a small raid. Kamose must have died quite soon after his expedition to Avaris, and he was succeeded by Seqenenre-Ptah's young son, Ahmose, who was so young that he needed his mother Ahotep to rule as regent for him, and she did a very good job, and she was very well respected and revered for doing so. Once of age, Ahmose launched his own military attack against the Hyksos at Avaris. He attacked and besieged Avaris and sacked the city, destroying buildings and setting fire, which spread uncontrollably but deliberately throughout the city. He then forced the Hyksos and their followers back into Syria-Palestine, where he besieged the fort of Sharuhen for 3 years. By doing so, Ahmose was now the king of the whole reunified Egypt, and this heralded the start of the New Kingdom. This video is supposed to be about the New Kingdom, so let's get back to it. It's very interesting to study the key characteristics of this period: warfare, building programs, religion and temples, kingship. But why did they happen the way they did? What caused them, and why were these focuses so key to Egypt in the New Kingdom? Many of these themes were standard kingly policies, but the amount of focus, energy and resources that were paid to them, or the specific actions that took place, were in fact triggered or caused by the Second Intermediate Period. And now we can understand ancient Egypt during the New Kingdom so much better. Let's start with warfare, foreign policy and empire during the New Kingdom. This is something that a lot of the pharaohs, but not all of them, paid a lot of attention and a lot of money to during the New Kingdom. Egypt had had some sort of relationship with Nubia and states in Syria-Palestine for well over 1,000 years, ranging from amicable trade to invasions, and in the case of Lower Nubia during the Middle Kingdom, occupation and forts inhabited by soldiers to gain control of the gold mines and to control the locals. But all of this exploded during the New Kingdom. During the 18th and 19th dynasties of the New Kingdom, warrior pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Rameses II developed a huge empire, extending its borders north by fighting enemies to eventually annex the whole of Palestine and much of Syria, and south to control Nubia for hundreds of miles close to the Fifth Cataract. Other kings were less interested in extending their empire through warfare, but they still had to send their armies in occasionally to quash rebellions in Syria-Palestine and uprisings of locals in Nubia. And throughout this period, pharaohs relied on diplomacy, ideological oppression, and reluctant obedience of the Syria-Palestine vassal rulers and Nubian chiefs. The Second Intermediate Period had put Egypt in a catch-22 position, damned if they did and damned if they didn't. The north of Egypt had been ruled by the Hyksos, who the Egyptian kings saw as a foreign enemy. This was a nightmare situation in the pharaoh's eyes and against the rules of Ma'at, rightness and justice in the world versus chaos and disorder, which the pharaoh must maintain the balance of for the benefit of Egypt. This had obligated Ahmose to chase the Hyksos and their followers out of Egypt and back into Syria-Palestine. And he had besieged Sharuhen for 3 years in order to prevent them from coming back. Ahmose and his successors needed to protect Egypt from potential future invaders. So this campaign of defensive, preemptive military strikes in Syria-Palestine continued under the next few kings of the 18th dynasty. However, the Egyptians themselves were now the attackers, invaders of this region, and they had painted a target on their own backs, opening themselves up to potential attacks from rulers in Syria-Palestine. During the rest of the New Kingdom, therefore, pharaohs had to conquer and annex neighbouring land in this area in order to guard Egypt's borders by creating a buffer zone to prevent invasions into Egypt proper. And they had to diplomatically placate or militarily defeat and control the vassal rulers and inhabitants of their new empire, as well as their formidable new neighbours to the north and west, such as the Hittites. In Nubia during the Second Intermediate Period, the king of Kush, ally of the Hyksos and southern Egypt's neighbour, had been a powerful enemy. He had taken control of the Nubian gold mines and their nearby forts that the Egyptians had set up and controlled in order to profit from the gold mines and to control Nile traffic during the Middle Kingdom, the period preceding the Second Intermediate Period. The fact that the king of Kush now had control of these gold mines and that the Upper Egyptian kings didn't meant that Upper Egypt was now impoverished, and it allowed the king of Kush to become wealthy and even more powerful. During the late Second Intermediate Period, Upper Egyptian king Kamose took control of the fort of Buhen, and therefore he controlled the region between the southern Egyptian border and the Second Cataract. This forced the Kerma Nubians, who were loyal to the king of Kush, far away from the Egyptian border, back to the Kerma region. As a result, Kamose regained access to the gold mines and he was able to protect Egypt's southern border. The kings of Egypt during the early New Kingdom therefore had to retain control of this area of Nubia so that they could exploit the gold mines and control the trade of exotic goods from further south in Africa. This was so that they could rebuild the Egyptian economy and pay for lots of expensive things like their building programs, but also their very expensive military campaigns in Syria-Palestine, as well as to prevent the king of Kush from benefiting from Nubia financially, becoming wealthy and powerful again, or potentially other enemies who would do the same. Lower Nubia was a buffer zone between the southern border of Egypt and the king of Kush in the south of Nubia, but the Egyptian kings wanted to eliminate this threat entirely, which eventually Thutmose I did during the 18th dynasty. So, besides minor uprisings from locals during the New Kingdom, Egypt didn't really have a threat in Nubia. Besides guarding Egypt from foreign threats, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, with the memory of the Second Intermediate Period at the forefront of their minds, knew the importance of needing to control Egypt internally. They needed to prevent threats to themselves and the country from within, such as political or violent rebellions or usurpers to the throne, which could lead to another intermediate period with the country divided, or even a total takeover of the throne. Traditionally and ideologically, the whole of Egypt was supposed to be ruled by one strong male king, his titles being the Lord of the Two Lands, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, i.e. the king of the whole country, not just part of it as it had been during the Second Intermediate Period. To hold on to this newly regained rule over the whole country, they had to restore the Egyptian throne to its full power. and cement the pharaoh's authority so his control over the country couldn't weaken. Generally, these kings used several methods for this, including installing a solid and loyal government, preventative and, when necessary, punishing law and order, and using propaganda such as iconographic representations of the king as war leader, defending Egypt and keeping it safe, showing the king as strong and capable. This would make him and the office of kingship appear to be as great and mighty as he wanted it to be in real life, in order to prevent anyone from launching a coup. But the pharaoh had to actually make his position and his royal dynasty as strong as he claimed it was, chiefly by ensuring that his son would take over the throne next. Hereditary kingship had been the ideal situation for the past 1,000 years or more of Egyptian history, with the son of the current king taking his father's throne once he had died. During the Second Intermediate Period, this rarely took place, if at all. But this wasn't such a concern during the Second Intermediate Period, a period of weakness when what you really needed was to ensure that the throne was occupied by a strong ruler, even if he was from non-royal stock. However, during the New Kingdom, the pharaoh and his loyal supporters needed to continue this current royal line, this dynasty, for as long as possible. The lack of a legitimate and healthy son and heir could lead to the weakening of this family's hold over Egypt, leaving a void in the king's palace, or even a new royal seat created by a rival to control part of Egypt in a new intermediate period. Either way, the throne may be potentially seized by a relative of the king who may be a rival, a powerful politician championed by disloyal members of the elite, or even a random non-royal usurper. Therefore, the early New Kingdom royal family had strict rules. Throughout Egyptian history, the pharaoh was the only person who was allowed to marry more than one woman at a time. This was in order to increase the number of offspring that he would have, in order to guarantee a healthy heir to the throne. In previous periods, the king had been allowed to marry his own half-sisters, but during the 18th dynasty, royal women were banned from marrying anyone other than the king. This prevented them from marrying into influential families, which would increase these families' power and sway over the king, and could lead to a potential claim over the throne as the king's brother-in-law. During the New Kingdom, it was common for the crown prince to be the boots-on-ground leader of the army, and to hold important positions in government and priesthood in order to prepare him for his future role as pharaoh. However, spare royal sons, i.e. not the crown prince, were often not allowed to hold important positions in government or the army, likely because these were routes to political power and loyal supporters, which would potentially allow them to become rivals to their brother in future. The lack of an army role also protected these spare sons from potential death on the battlefield too, in case the crown prince died and the next one in line had to step up. However, such methods to securing an heir to the throne didn't always work, as Amenhotep I shows, who died without an heir, as his successor, Tutmosis I, was not the son of royal parents. However, the Egyptian throne was so well established, respected and strong at this time, only up to 50 years into the New Kingdom since the end of the Second Intermediate Period, that there was no political disorder when Tutmosis I, a non-royal, took the throne. The 18th dynasty continued in force. You all right? Hi, I'm back from having dinner. It's now really late in the evening, so I've got the big light on, so sorry about the change of light, but let's carry on. Another way the pharaoh stamped his authority all over Egypt was great building programs, including temples, palaces, and even new cities. Such ambitious projects, from the beginning of pharaonic history, demonstrated the king's position as head of the government and lord of the land. and his great wealth and ability to command resources, including manpower and materials. Just think of the pyramids, which were and still are visible as symbols of the king from miles away. However, this was something the Second Intermediate Period Theban kings couldn't do, as their access to resources and wealth was diminished due to not being able to control the gold mines in Nubia. Therefore, once the gold was flowing again at the beginning of the New Kingdom and Ahmose had reunified the whole country, he was able to command his architects to start a building program in the tradition of previous kings. While Ahmose could have chosen anywhere throughout the country to start, he didn't choose just anywhere. He was going to rebuild the capital city of his former enemies, Avaris, under his own Egyptian name. When Ahmose defeated the Hyksos, he destroyed the city, as demonstrated by the archaeology, destruction layers, and evidence of widespread burned buildings. Ahmose could therefore rebuild the city as he wished, and he decided to build a palace complex where the Hyksos had built a defensive fortress when tensions with the Thebans were heightened. This symbolically represented Ahmose defeating the Hyksos again, the Egyptian king's political and ideological authority crushing the Hyksos' military might. Ahmose had sent the message that Avaris was under his control, under the power of the Egyptian king. It couldn't turn back to Hyksos control and was a warning message to potential future invaders. It had been turned back into an Egyptian settlement, as it had been before the aberrance of the Second Intermediate Period. Approximately 1300 years later, Rameses II built on top of and extended this city to be his new capital, his residence, as the city was close to where his family were originally from. And of course, it was close to the Egyptian-Syria-Palestine Empire border. Pharaohs and their governments commissioned many more buildings, monuments and constructions as part of their management of the country, such as local government buildings, granaries and other storehouses for foodstuff, and other simple or mundane constructions. Most buildings in ancient Egypt were made from unfired mud bricks, and towns and cities in beneficial locations tended to be built on top of with newer settlements. Therefore, relatively few urban buildings and architecture have survived into modern times. State temples were one of the few constructions built from stone from the New Kingdom onwards, meaning some of these have survived well relative to other types of buildings and seem to represent a large proportion of the pharaoh's wealth and resources. It is true that the kings focused a lot on temples and religious matters during the New Kingdom, but they still did their duty to Egypt by building and maintaining infrastructure and provisions for the country. This helped to secure their authority as ruler, deliver for their people, and secure the loyalty of their population and prevent rebellions by doing so. But returning to New Kingdom temples and religion, Ahmose and his successors throughout the New Kingdom did what the pharaohs of the Second Intermediate Period couldn't: spend a huge amount of resources to build temples and honour the gods. They built temples to different gods throughout Egypt and Nubia, and in this way they showed their authority throughout both of these lands and placated the different gods that were in the Egyptian pantheon. But they did focus largely on the New Kingdom state god, Amun or Amun-Ra. One of Amun's roles was to grant the king success in foreign battles. So, to remain in Amun's favour for their warfare in Syria-Palestine, the kings built, extended and improved huge temple complexes to Amun, in particular in Thebes, where he was the patron deity, in the temples of Karnak and Luxor. When they returned from battle, in thanks for his divine support, the kings provided the Temple of Karnak with booty from war campaigns, tribute from vassal states and items of trade. And together with extensive farmland owned by this temple, the Karnak priesthood became extremely powerful by the end of the New Kingdom. And the Temple of Karnak became the biggest temple complex in the history of ancient Egypt and throughout the rest of the Pharaonic period. Thank you so much for watching this video. It's been a long one, but I hope it gives you a good introduction to some of the important aspects of the New Kingdom. And I hope it explains some of the reasons this period of Egyptian history happened the way it did, in a large part due to the impact of the Second Intermediate Period. Subscribe for more lessons on ancient Egypt, including many more videos on the New Kingdom, and follow me on Instagram if you wish. Now, I'm off to bed. Good night.